in our artwork, we're basically proposing a primary question, which is on who is smart in an unequal city, as the discourses on the differences between rural and urban characterizations and implications of smartness have been discussed. But in cities like Karachi, where there is extensive inequality, not only in the way that people live, but also in the different kinds of practices that are applied for, say, cases of climate change, in which there are very different approaches that are taken up. How can we really homogenize the city and the way that smartness is put into action? So what we're trying to see here through this artwork, in which we've sort of juxtaposed thermal imagery with some sketches in order to examine not only the smart practices that are taking place in a certain gentrified section of the city, but also the different vernacular cooling practices and materialities and technologies that come into play to actually add to this inequality that already exists, both socially and politically. What we've tried to do, and as you can see in the panel, is that on the left-hand panel, we have a dense old city area, which is characteristic of the central business district there. It is characterized by high rises, glass buildings, the very attempted way of showing smartness. There are buildings that are equipped with solar panels. They're completely dependent on artificial sources of cooling. But what is happening in all of this smartness is that it is reflecting the heat of the sun back onto the streets, where people such as the pedestrians or street vendors are actually becoming the recipient of all this reflection of the already hot climate. So as we show it through some of the thermal images on that panel, glass facade buildings that are already south-facing have temperatures as high as 66.6 being read on it, whereas the older form of construction that relied on stone as a primary construction material gives us a reading of about 24.3 degrees. So we can see that striking contrast of the way in which temperature is can be seen in these buildings that are attempting to become smart. But at the same time, on the rightmost panel, what you see is localized vernacular practices of dealing with that same heat. And the temperature readings show that these so-called unsmart practices actually work a lot more effectively in order to mitigate that heat. So we see temperatures as low as sometimes 24 degrees, 30 degrees, and the indoor space is, and this is not just the indoor space. So a lot of this is a courtyard that has direct sunlight exposure, but because of the way in which people have retrofitted the space with different kind of fabrics for shade, or the use of clay pots for storage of drinking water, or some makeshift stalls that actually rely on the changing patterns of shade to reorient themselves throughout the day, they're able to mitigate the impacts of heat so much more than a smart building that is relying on electricity, but when utility provision is erratic, it ends up creating more problems than solutions for the people occupying the building, as well as for those who are outside it. And what we show through the center panel is basically how greening practices in the city remain very isolated in this form of climate management. So they're only either aesthetic additions, or let's say the roof gardens, seasonal flowers, and even certain species of plants that are associated with aesthetics, such as palm trees, but which are not indigenous to the city and are actually not the best choice when it comes to hot, arid climates like Karachi. They come at the expense of cutting down native species such as the banyan trees, which not only have greater foliage, but can always be seen to be occupied by the pedestrians and informal workers as a very constant form of shade. So while we visualize these disparities of smartness in the unequal city, we try to see what we're actually prompting the question that what then is the future smart city going to look like? Because if the city is driven by these ideas of moving towards smartness, they're only going to make life difficult for over 62% of the population that either lives or works in the informal sector. So yeah.